Climate change. It's the burning issue for all of us, isn't it? After all, don't we all inhabit the same lonely planet in the vast blackness of space? Well, not necessarily. Without wishing to be indelicate, some of us are going to be on this planet for a lot longer than others. Thousands of young people here in the UK and across the world today walked out of lessons to protest about what they see as a lack of action from middle-aged politicians to cut carbon emissions. Polling from the UK and the US suggests that the younger generation are considerably more worried about climate change than older people.
They need to start taking young people seriously and start listening to our voice and making sure that they recognise in their policy making that we're the ones who have the biggest stake in our future and that they need to change their legislation to reflect that.
I don't want to give trillions and trillions of dollars. I don't want to lose millions and millions of jobs. I don't want to be put at a disadvantage.
Popular pressure is absolutely part of this. Because, you know, politicians respond when their feet are held to the fire. And so absolutely that's part of it. There also needs to be political leadership.
Is this a shot we can hear being fired in a generational war? There's a fundamental economic and political tension here. The worst costs of climate change will not be felt for decades.
As we get warmer and warmer, those risks are only going to increase and start to impact food supply, water supply, people's health, and our natural world. Our wildlife species are at risk of, in some cases, going extinct as a result of climate change. But what probably worries me the greatest is the risk of collapse of the vast ice sheets covering Greenland and West Antarctica, which would eventually lead to meters of sea level rise, displacing hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
But the expensive action needed to tackle it, carbon taxes, higher energy bills, tougher regulation, must be borne by people today. Yet are the interests of young and old really in opposition? How should we think about those future economic and social costs of an overheated planet? Policymakers normally use a cost-benefit analysis to decide whether or not to do something. If benefits exceed the costs, government should act. We can estimate the future economic costs of climate change in terms of lost global GDP, but that pain won't be endured until many decades have passed. So how should we value that damage today? Normally costs are discounted on the basis that we will all, hopefully, be richer in the future and they will be easier to bear. That could mean the benefits today of getting rid of future costs of climate change looking smaller than the costs of action, implying we shouldn't act. But what if we don't discount those future costs? That would mean the benefits exceeding today's costs once again, meaning we should act. Nicholas Stern wrote a landmark report on the economics of climate change in 2006 for the UK government. And he used a virtually zero discount rate in his cost-benefit analysis, meaning future climate change costs are treated as if they are being felt now. And Lord Stern concluded that made an overwhelming case for action from governments today to decarbonise.
Because future generations might be worse off than now, you would want to have low discounting. In other words, you would want to value benefits that accrue to them in a rather positive way relative to benefits that accrue now. But discriminating by date of birth, I think most people would regard as morally unacceptable. And it's that position which I took, and that position which I think is a correct one from the point of view of most people's ethical valuations.
So, in other words, according to Lord Stern, damage to generations in the future should be accounted for as damage to lives today.
I think young people are absolutely part and a key to this because they get it, they instinctively get it. But I genuinely believe that we can persuade people across the population that this has got to be a priority. And the way we do that is by saying there can be a better life for people.
If anything disappears, the world will not be complete, and it will be all their fault.
So you think everyone should do something?
Everybody.
Ice cores in Antarctica.
So economic theory suggests young and old really are all in it together. But is that a lesson our politicians can learn?
We did ask the government for an interview on this, but no one was available. I'm now joined by Anna Taylor, a 17-year-old environmental activist from the UK Student Climate Network, Rebecca Lowe, director of FREA, which is part of the free market think tank, the IEA, and Sir Ed Davey, who was the Energy and Climate Change Secretary in the coalition government and is now Lib Dem's Home Affairs spokesperson. And let's start with you, Anna, as you were on the march. I hope it's not rude to anyone else to say you are the only younger generation person in this room right now. Make the case, particularly to him, the older generation, politicians like him, you believe they've failed you.
We do feel deeply betrayed and deeply let down by past generations, actually. I feel very disappointed that 15,000 students had to walk out of school today in the UK. I wish we didn't have to do that, but we feel like it was our only option. And I do think, unfortunately, we feel betrayed by past generations and past governments.
And Ed Davey, I mean, you were in a position to do something as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. I'm sure you say you did, but she says you failed. It wasn't enough. You fell short.
We should have done more. We did a huge amount. I mean, the Liberal Democrats managed to nearly quadruple renewable energy. And what I've been so disappointed with and angry with, and that's why I share the anger of the young people and the protests today, is that since 2015, the Conservatives have got rid of something called the Zero Carbon Homes Rate Law. They have stopped onshore wind. They've not given a go-ahead to tidal lagoons. These are the practical measures which will make sure we don't betray the next generation. We can offer hope. And I'm actually inspired by what the young people have done today. And I think it's time this government listened, and indeed governments around the world listened to the young people who are coming together across the world to tell us, do more, do it faster.
But do you buy that, Anna? I mean, you listen to that, it sounds a bit like passing the buck. It wasn't us, it's them now.
I do wonder why you think you did enough why didn't you declare a climate emergency? Why didn't you do everything that we've written in our demands? I think everything we're discussing should have been done years before now.
I mean, she's right, you didn't unfreeze fuel duty. Your Lib Dem colleague, Danny Alexander, was in the Treasury at the time. Friends of the Earth said that was a shocking disregard for the nation's health. You launched a number of fracking sites. You lost the fight to get the decarbonisation target into the 2013 Energy Act.
Well, actually, what we did, Liberal Democrats in Europe, we managed to get the climate change targets for the whole of Europe massively increased. And that helped us win the battle at Paris. And I think without the Liberal Democrats in Europe pushing more ambitious targets...
You did do enough?
We did a huge amount. What's really disappointed is that huge base that we managed when actually Britain was leading the world in offshore wind, fantastic record, that's not been taken forward by this government. And what I'd like to see, and why I'm so disappointed about Brexit, is that we need the world to come together. What this protest has been doing is young people around the world coming together, realising that you need international collaboration if you're going to tackle climate change. Liberal Democrats believe in that. That's what we did in government. And unfortunately, with Brexit, this government is preventing that collaboration that the young people are showing is what is needed.
And Rebecca, the way this is being built at the moment, it looks like it is a sort of generational battle, the young pitted against the old. Is it that simple? Is it the young all believe this, the old don't?
I never really think it's a particularly good idea to say the young are one set and they're all the same. I mean, young people are individuals. I'm sure you disagree about some things with some of your friends, and that's a healthy way to be. I think, to my mind, the point here is, I think the consensus is that, obviously there is such a thing as anthropogenic climate change. There are very, very few people who aren't. I mean, that's the truth. Very few people aren't convinced by that. Might be some disagreement about rates and stuff. But there's really a question about priorities and there's a question about solutions. And the way in which we come to make decisions about those things, largely in a kind of nation like ours, is through democratic deliberation. And that's not just about voting, it's about campaigning, it's about informing people. And that's why I'm so impressed that you guys have gone out and have been informing people about this, because it's not just teaching what the truth of the matter is, it's also about showing what you think that priority is. Now, part of the problem about making priorities is that you have a whole load of other issues and some of them are interrelated. So, for instance, I don't know, if you just spent all the budget on one specific climate change demand, then maybe the education budget would have to be cut. And then, of course, education plays in because you need education to fund research. And then research is going to go on and make goods and products which the market is going to drive. And then those costs are going to be driven down. So, I mean, it's all very interrelated. It's very, very difficult to decide what priority a certain policy should take or a certain area should take. But of course, when there is mass uprising about a certain issue within a democracy, then politicians need to listen.
Presumably, as you say, everybody agrees this needs to be sorted. It's just how we sort it. Is the market going to sort it? Is innovation going to sort it? Do we need more policy? I mean, where do you stand on that? What do you want?
I think direct environmental reform needs to be put in place to sort it. I don't think that's being recognised enough. And I think what we've seen is a historical focus on economic policy, which means that throughout history, environmental policy has always been minimised and not taken seriously enough. And that's why we're in the position we are in today. And that's why young people are feeling the need to speak out now.
And Rebecca, do you believe that this can be done through the markets? Do you believe that innovation is going to help, is going to make this change?
So I think there are two things. One is the point about policy and what are the best ways to solve this. And personally, I think some of the policies we've seen put in place by the UK government over the last decade or so, they're sort of tinkering around the edges and they're sometimes quite efficient use of red tape. We've got like the warm homes thing and we've got the levy here. Personally, I think there are some very good sort of single market-based solutions like the cap and trade thing they have in Ontario or having a carbon tax. I would personally prefer to see a solution like that. But I think we also need to remember that for all we can manage to try to drive things here, we've also got to try and convince people abroad as well. Because there are some nations, developing nations, where they may say, well, you know, you guys had an industrial revolution, you were able to use fossil fuels, now we're not. Now, that might be a good argument. The point is, we need to try and convince these people. There might be other people in other countries where they just say, no, we're not listening to you. So it's a point about international...
That. It would be nice to know, as someone from the IEA, whether you're actually funded by those sorts of people.
Well, we can talk about funding. That's a point about privacy. I'm happy to have a full debate with you about privacy and the importance of privacy and the role, indeed, that places like think tanks play within democratic deliberation. But I think that's rather to be leaving the topic here. I think the point is that we have young people. How many of you are out today campaigning?
15,000. 15,000
people campaigning about this issue, and you're bringing out the funding of a single think tank. I think it's going off the topic a little, to be honest. I think it's a little disingenuous and unfair, to be honest.
And Anna, do you agree? Do you... in terms of what you think is going to happen, would you agree? Would you agree with what she said about, you know, the developing world is spending, you know, needs to use these sorts of fossil fuels and other?
No, I think I've seen a lot of people try to move the blame onto those countries, and that's a way of not acknowledging our responsibility. I think developed countries have actually a greater responsibility because we're in an economic position where we can implement the environmental reforms that perhaps developing countries can't.
And then, Davey, the solution, what is the solution?
Actually, solar power and wind power are things that will help the developing countries, not fossil fuels. It's solar power. You can go into rural Africa and rural India and give them development as well as tackling climate change. And we've got to be more radical. Liberal Democrats actually want to change capitalism. I think banks and the regulation on the city has to be tougher because they are not actually investing in these green technologies in the way they are. We're still seeing far too much capital going to fossil fuels. And if we're going to listen and respond to the protests today, we've actually got to get to the grip of it. We've got to make sure that the pensions regulator, the listings authority, all the regulations on the banks, make sure that these big investors...
Is that possible when all the democratic incentives are short-term?
You know, it is impossible. Listen to the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. He's one of the champions of these sort of reforms that I'm talking about. And if we really get to grips with the way that the big investors make their decisions by ensuring that climate risk is properly taken into account in those decisions, I think we can really respond in a very radical way
Anna,
to young people today.
are you walking away hopeful from this?
I'm not actually. I'm seeing politicians arguing amongst themselves, and I'm not seeing youth views being considered again. I think they're talking... It's the same policies and the same debates being argued about again and again. When are young people going to be listened to?
Anna Taylor, Ed Davey and Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.